After Yelena Belova tried to kill Natasha and me, I restrained her using my special invincible handcuffs, and Natasha Romanoff called Yelena Belova a bitch for trying to hurt me, and then Yelena Belova said, "Wow, you must really love him," and then Natasha Romanoff said, "He's my husband, not my boyfriend," and then Yelena Belova said, "Wow, and you didn't even invite me to the wedding," and then Natasha Romanoff said, "I couldn't invite you to the wedding anyway because the Red Room is controlling your mind, dumbass, or did you forget about that?" And then Yelena Belova said, "Go home, Natasha, and take your boyfriend with you, I don't need your help," and then I said, "You can't beat the Red Room by yourself, but I can help you with everything. I have the powers of a god. Trust me, I can help you." And then Yelena Belova smiled like a pervert and she said, "You're very handsome, but I don't know anything about you because someone didn't tell me about you." And then Natasha Romanoff said, "I couldn't tell you anything because I was trying to escape the Red Room because I met him and I was pregnant with his children." And then Yelena Belova said, "That's bullshit, that's impossible, the Red Room took away our ability to have children." And then Natasha Romanoff said, "He has the powers of a literal god, his DNA healed all my reproductive organs, when we had sex it regenerated all my reproductive organs." And then Yelena Belova said, "Whoa, way too much information. Gross, I don't want to hear about someone having sex with you, Natasha, but that's actually great news to me, I'll keep that in mind." And then Yelena Belova smiled at me like a pervert and winked, and then Natasha got irritated and for the first time she got a bit jealous and she said, "Leave him alone and just tell me what your plan was to save all the Black Widows." And then Yelena Belova looked down upset, and then Natasha Romanoff asked Yelena Belova, "You do have a plan, right?" And then Yelena Belova said, "Well, I have part of a plan." And then Natasha Romanoff said, "Dumbass, you don't even have a plan." And then Yelena said, "I'm not a dumbass, I found a way to disable the mind control on the Black Widows and I have the formula, I was going to use it to free them all." And Natasha asked, "Do you have it with you?" And Yelena said, "Yes." And then Yelena said to me, "I told you what you wanted to know. Now please let me go." And then I released Yelena Belova and she said, "You're very big and tall, how do you even kiss him, Natasha? Would you use a stool?" And Natasha said, "That's none of your business." And then I said, "I can change my height." And then Yelena Belova smirked like a pervert and she asked me, "What else can you change the size of?" And then I blushed and I said, "Well, I can do anything, my powers have no limits." And then Natasha Romanoff said, "Leave him alone." And then Yelena said, "I don't need you, Natasha, but I'll take your boyfriend, I definitely need him." And then Natasha got angry and she said, "We are leaving in the morning and you will show us where to go, the sooner I get this done the better." And then Yelena said, "I'm going to get dad and mom." And then Natasha Romanoff asked Yelena, "Are you insane? Do you know where Alexei Shostakov is?" And then Yelena Belova said, "Yes, I know where he is." But then Yelena Belova smirked at me like a pervert again and she said, "But your husband could easily get him out of prison with his superpowers." And then I said loudly, "I also know every type of magic," and I smiled warmly. And then Yelena smiled like a pervert and she said, "Oh, he's a magical man." And then Natasha Romanoff scowled at Yelena with anger and irritation. And then while Natasha Romanoff was sleeping, Yelena Belova somehow got me onto the shield helicarrier that Natasha flew us in, and I woke up and I saw Natasha Romanoff running after our aircraft and I said, "Wait, please don't leave her." And then Yelena said, "We don't need her, she will just be in the way, and besides she doesn't need to be here to see what happens next." And then I asked Yelena Belova, "What are you talking about?" And then Yelena Belova looked at me and she smiled like a pervert and I said, "Oh, well, I'm married." And then Yelena said, "Yes, well, I know all about you because you're famous and you're in a polygamous marriage." And then Yelena said, "It's strange because I thought polygamous marriage was illegal in the United States." And I said it was, but I used my powers to rewrite the marriage laws in the United States. And then I giggled cutely and then Yelena Belova looked at me like a pervert again and I asked her, "What are you going to do with me?" And then she said, "Well, I would think that is obvious, but you and I both know you will allow it." And then I said, "You want to be able to have kids?" And then Yelena said, "Oh God, no, I just want to have sex with a handsome man, me having kids is really just a bonus." And then I said, "Yes, well, someone has to fly the plane." And then Yelena Belova smirked and said, "This helicarrier has autopilot and besides I'm not in a rush to rescue Alexei Shostakov yet."